sure you know that it's very popular to hate men right now. I see evidence of this cultural man-hating attitude daily. I used to participate in this culture. I was angry and resentful toward men for most of my late teens and into my early 20s. In both my undergraduate and my graduate education, I was taught to view all issues of power and all issues of social justice only through the lens of the patriarchy. I learned over and over that men are the oppressors and everyone else is the oppressed. Although I know so many good men and have always had good men in my life, I viewed them as exceptions to the rule. As I understood it, all men had the socially sanctioned option to treat women badly because of the society that they inherited, but I believed that some of them had made the personal choice to treat the women in their life well despite this. As I understood it, the good men in my life were working against the system that they inherited, but they still ultimately benefited from the system that oppressed so many, myself included. Then I became a therapist and two things started to happen. First, I started seeing how negatively people were perceiving men, just in general. And second, I saw how the constant negative messaging was impacting the mental health of individual men. These observations led to me realizing that the way I had been taught to view issues of social justice and issues of gender are very problematic. I found that this modern framework for understanding social justice issues has led to a cultural interpretation of beliefs about gender that are at best indifferent to and at worst in favor of male suffering. Hi, I'm Gabriella. I'm a licensed trauma and attachment therapist, and I realized that we are utterly failing our boys and men in this country, and I'm trying to explore this topic more and figure out what we need to do about it. So after seeing the magnitude of male suffering in my clinical practice, I realized that I actually had no framework for understanding what was happening with boys and men. And more importantly, I realized that whatever's happening to boys and men is not being acknowledged in the way that it needs to be. My first task was to observe the lived experience of boys and men in our society. So I started observing the culture, and the first thing that I noticed was how acceptable it is to speak abusively about men in the mainstream media. This video is of one instance I noticed between Jordan Peterson and Piers Morgan. I posted that a few months ago, and a few people asked me if I'd seen the Red Pill documentary. I'd heard of it, but I hadn't seen it. I still had a bad taste in my mouth for men's rights, and to be honest, I was bummed that people kept asking me to watch a documentary about men's rights. I knew that there was something going on with men. I'd seen it directly in my clinical practice, and I've seen it culturally, but I didn't think that it was an issue of rights. I think to myself and to most people who care about women's rights, hearing men talk about fighting for men's rights, it seems a little bit like Augustus Gloop from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, who has an unlimited supply of chocolate, but is choosing to take a bite out of the single chocolate bar that Charlie gets every year on his birthday. It feels gluttonous, out of touch, and honestly a little bit offensive. As a precursor to what I'm about to say next, I want this channel to be an actual record of my thoughts, so I'm not going to sugarcoat to save face. I assumed that this documentary was going to be a bunch of men who were mad about feminism and wanted to make the case that men are more oppressed than women. I did not know where this documentary was going to take me in terms of content, but I have such a negative connotation of the red pill world and of the manosphere. I assumed I was going to be frustrated or offended by the messaging of this documentary. I assumed that this pro-men rhetoric would be anti-woman, because that's how I've been taught to view all men's rights advocacy. So I watched this documentary probably like 10 times just so I could fully absorb it. And the first few times I watched it with that defensive shell that humans tend to have when our identity is being challenged. And before I did the work that culminated in the creation of this video, I identified really strongly with the feminist line of thinking. So it was very cognitively and ideologically disorienting to hear a men's rights activist speak about men's rights and wholeheartedly agree with everything that he was saying. I still don't know if I'm allowed to swear on YouTube, so I'll bleep it out, but it was a bit of a mind. It was really shocking to me that I hadn't heard of any of these points brought up in the documentary ever, and I have a bachelor's degree in psychology, a master's degree in social work, and I'm someone who's very well versed in social justice issues. The most meaningful information that I learned from this documentary was information about myself. Before I watched this documentary and then continued to explore men's rights issues extensively for the next 2 months, I had no idea how ignorant I was about men's issues. I know so much about feminism, and I know so much about women's issues, and that's a start, but that's not even half of the equation. So I spent the last 2 months studying men's issues and reading and learning and watching anything that I could get my hands on. I literally felt like a movie character who was capturing as many ideas as they could and tying them together and connecting them with string. And I literally felt like that's what I was doing, because that literally is what I was doing. I used the biopsychosocial spiritual model of assessment to categorize all of the issues that men face in all of these different domains. So this wall is my map. I've put down all of the keywords and potential areas that I need to explore in order to get a good understanding of all these different issues. So shout out to the 10 or so people that recommended that I watch this documentary, because I think you've determined what my life is going to look like for the next couple of years. Because what I've found in my research is that our absolute failure to acknowledge and work toward correcting the issues facing boys and men is so much worse than I anticipated. And to be clear, that doesn't mean that girls and women have it good or even have it better. Boys and men and girls and women have issues that they face that are specific to their sex class, and both are worthy of our time and attention. I still care as much about girls and women's issues as I did before I got into this. So, oh my goodness, please don't fall into the trap of comparing suffering, because it doesn't work, it hasn't worked, and it's not gonna get us anywhere. What I have learned is that as a society, we need to care about boys and men at least as much as we care about girls and women, because our success is so inextricably linked that it is pointless to care about one group without being aware of and concerned with the health and wellness of the other. The world looks completely different than it did 20 years ago, and needless to say, gender roles look completely different than they did 20 years ago. We need to be communicating about how men and women are supposed to relate to each other now that the roles are no longer explicit. Instead, the state of gender discourse has become a terrible canoe trip down an unpleasant river, and nobody is having a good time. We have women's rights advocates on one side, rowing one direction, and men's rights on one side, rowing the opposite direction, and nobody's getting anywhere. We've gone in so many circles, everybody is frustrated, dizzy, and nauseous. And a lot of people are just giving up, which is understandable. We need to coordinate our oaring, and that can only happen if we learn how to communicate effectively about issues and we learn how to validate each other's lived experiences without constantly one-upping each other to prove that one group has it worse than the other. That doesn't do anything helpful. The aim of my channel is to facilitate a conversation about the problems facing boys and men, because we cannot have a healthy and safe and productive society without healthy, safe, and productive men. For the rest of this video, I want to get into how this documentary changed my understanding of both the feminist movement and of the men's rights movement. To start out, I want to talk about what I think has gone wrong in the feminist movement. And to do that, we have to have an understanding of what's happening on a physiological level. So I'm going to start out with a brief overview of how the nervous system functions, because if we want to understand any of this, we need to know how the nervous system functions. My favorite way to understand the nervous system is using polyvagal theory. The idea of polyvagal theory is that our nervous system has 3 states. The first is just what I call the green. It is our rest and digest. When we are regulated, we're in this green state. Our body is calm and connected. We're curious, we're open, we can connect with other people, and we're able to be compassionate and present in the moment. We can see that our body functions really well when we're in this state. This is an optimal state of functioning. But when our nervous system detects a threat, it sends us up into another state, which is our fight or flight. I just call this being in the yellow. When we're in the yellow, there is still a chance that we're going to survive this threat. You can see right here it says I can, referring to I can survive. So we are either moving toward the threat to fight it, or we're moving away from the threat to escape it. But there is still an idea that we're going to live. Physiologically, we can see that our blood pressure and our heart rate increase, our fuel availability increases, as does our adrenaline. It's really important to notice that when we're in fight or flight, our ability to relate to others decreases, which makes sense, right? Like if you are actually fighting to stay alive, it doesn't make sense to be like, hey, I'm going to relate to everybody and make new friends. No, that system needs to turn off, because all that matters is our survival in this moment. If the threat continues and our body is realizing, okay, there's a chance that we might not survive this threat, we can see that it switches from I can to I can't. And when people are in the freeze state, it's basically preparation for death. The body really slows down just to conserve energy to try and survive. We can see the heart rate and the blood pressure decrease. Our facial expressions and our eye contact decrease. So does our social behavior and our attunement to human voices. So our nervous system very much informs how we relate to people. So when we're in the yellow or when we're in the red, it becomes much harder to listen to people, to relate to people, or to connect with people in any way. Because if we're trying to survive, it doesn't make sense to be empathetic and open and connected. The part of our brain that is scanning for danger and responds to it by mobilizing our nervous system into either a fight or flight response or a freeze response is sometimes called the reptile brain, because it's so automatic it doesn't even seem human. It's just reactionary in the way that a reptile would be. When our nervous system is activated, we are going to over-perceive stimuli as a threat, because it makes way more sense to do so. If our nervous system has determined that there is danger, it's way better to be safe than sorry. It's like a smoke alarm. You'd rather have a functioning smoke alarm that will go off once in a while when you're making toast than to have a smoke alarm that will never accidentally go off and might accidentally not go off when your house is on fire. It's that same principle. What this documentary demonstrated really well on a nervous system level is that when people are taught over and over that they are oppressed by the patriarchy, what I think is happening is that it's teaching their nervous system to perceive any narrative that centers the male experience as an imminent threat to their safety. I observed this happening in myself. As I was watching this documentary, there were a few times where I actively got mad. I had a fight response. I felt my heart rate increase and I noticed that my cheeks were getting flush and that my breath was getting more shallow. My nervous system's reactivity is because I have been taught to perceive all male power as a threat to my safety. So when I hear men speaking about the ways in which they're disenfranchised, my nervous system perceives that as danger. Because rather than hearing what is happening, which is men advocating for their health and well-being for the most part, my nervous system experiences men advocating for themselves as oppressors attempting to access more power with which to oppress. Even though logically I know that that's not necessarily an accurate way of understanding the world, my nervous system doesn't know that. My nervous system isn't logical. It's reactionary by nature, as are all of our nervous systems. That's kind of the point of nervous systems. My nervous system recognizes that it's evolutionarily advantageous to overperceive something as a threat than to underperceive it as a threat. And once I perceive a threat, logic goes out the window because I'm no longer in my logic part of my brain. My nervous system is activated, which is the part of my brain that is protecting me. My nervous system is still experiencing this rhetoric as if I were still an angry 20-year-old fight the patriarchy feminist, which is a far cry from where I am now. But my nervous system isn't going to update because, once again, it's not logical. So let's dig into this a little bit more. Here is my hypothesis on why I had never heard about or cared about any men's rights issues up until this point. I was taught to view all issues of power and all issues of gender only through the lens of the patriarchy and through the oppressed-oppressor narrative. Whether or not that's a good or even accurate way of understanding the world is beside the point of this analysis. We can talk about it later. What we're talking about is the implication of this narrative on a nervous system level. I'm going to show you a clip from the documentary that was exactly how I was taught to think about gender.
Political organizing comes from a feeling of victimization, which is why the men's rights movement makes that claim that men are the victims of discrimination. But it doesn't have much traction because, you look around and it's hard to see it. We don't have movements called, straight liberation. The question I would pose rhetorically is the men's rights movement really the gender version of the white nationalist movement? Because there are plenty of white people who say that they are the victims of reverse discrimination. So of course it's not going to have very much traction. You can't really organize the people who are superordinate.
I didn't realize it until this point, but this is the reason why I was so bummed that everyone kept asking me to watch this documentary. Think about what he is implying with this sentiment. Is the men's rights movement the gendered version of the white nationalist movement? Effectively, what he is saying is that men's rights activists can and potentially should be considered to be as dangerous as domestic terrorists, solely on the basis that they are advocating for men, and specifically potentially white and able-bodied men. When we understand the world through the oppressed-oppressor narrative, anytime men organize, we should understand that as a power grab. And remember that this idea isn't being presented by someone on a Reddit forum. This idea is being presented by a university professor. Theoretically, someone who should understand the implication of the doctrine that they're teaching. And here's one of the problems with choosing to see social justice through the oppressor-oppressed framework. Truly understanding any human dynamic requires the understanding of more than one perspective. I was taught one perspective. I was taught that all male organization around men's rights was an act of violence against women. And obviously, that led to me believing that there were no men's rights issues that were worth listening to. I was taught that the subordinate cannot organize because they are not victimized. So that when they do organize, I should consider their organization to be something bad. If I hear about a domestic terrorist group organizing near my house, I'm not going to be like, maybe they have some good ideas. Maybe I'll just stop in and say hello. I'm going to assume that whatever's happening over there is wrong and bad and is a threat to oppressed people. I was taught to view the world through the oppressor-oppressed narrative, and I was taught that only issues that fit within that narrative are worthy of my time and attention. But it turns out many of the issues that specifically men face do not fit within the liberal feminist framework of understanding social justice. As a result, people who subscribe to that line of thinking do not realize that there are ways that men are oppressed systemically, and that includes white men, and that includes white, able-bodied men. It's something I really didn't realize either until I got really deep in the literature and then taped all of these ideas onto my wall. Anytime men organize in a way that's not in the framework of the feminist movement, it is understood as violence. Here's a good example of that.
In 2012, Dr. Warren Farrell was speaking on behalf of men's issues at the University of Toronto in Canada. A feminist group protested the event.
Be fucking ashamed of yourself. You're fucking scum. You are fucking scum. Fucking rape apologist, incest supporting, woman hating, fucking scum.
Is there someone else that can wait?
Fucking scum. Yeah, just another.
I just want to listen to someone else's opinion. I'm not even on a side here. I just listen to as many people as I can.
You know what though? Why would you pay money to fucking support a fucking rape apologist if you weren't fucking one?
I never heard him say anything that was.
Well, it's fucking scum.
This woman is not perceiving this situation as a random man choosing to attend a lecture with a set of ideas being presented that she doesn't agree with. She's experiencing him as an oppressor who is looking for further ways to oppress. And because that's how she's experiencing herself, her behavior is acceptable to both her and to the people who also subscribe to that narrative. Her nervous system has sensed serious danger. She is in full fight response. And she's surrounded by a group of people who are also in a full fight response.
This is what men's rights look like! This is what men's rights look like! This is what men's rights look like!
I'm going to show you one last nervous system thing because I think it's one of the fatal flaws of liberal feminism. I call this the nervous system flip-flop. I'm a trauma therapist, so I'm really used to this flip-flop happening when I'm working with clients. We're sitting in session and they're fine and chill and they're talking about something, and a memory or a feeling triggers them, and I recognize that their nervous system activates. When that happens, I bring their activation to their awareness. I give them a few skills to deactivate their nervous system and bring them back into the green. That is incredibly important that people know how to do that because our thinking is distorted when our nervous system is activated. So when people are speaking about things that are important to them, it's really important that they're in the green because otherwise they're not logical. We all know this, but our brain thinks differently when we're sensing danger. And even the idea of a threat can activate our nervous system. So people in this movement recognize that male participation is required. And they genuinely do realize that men have issues that are worthy of care and attention. The justification is that men are also oppressed by the patriarchy, so they'll only recognize issues that fit comfortably within that framework, but nonetheless, they still acknowledge that there are issues. But they cannot hold space for any men talking about men's issues because it centers the male experience, and that immediately flips them into a fight response. I know about this well because I used to do this a lot. My parents still tease me about it because, like, at dinner parties, I would always correct people and make sure that they are using a feminist lens because I really did perceive any social issues looked at outside of that lens as a threat. Here's an example of this happening in real time. This is Big Red. She's a very loud feminist of the 2010s.
So, how old were you when you started calling yourself a feminist? Or how many years ago?
It was probably about 3 years ago, I guess you can say. I'm relatively new. Yeah, but I'm pretty loud, so silence only helps the oppressor, not the oppressed.
A lot of MRAs say that feminism doesn't fight for the rights of men. What would you say to that?
So she knows male participation is necessary. But then when Cassie makes a statement that centers the male experience, she flips into a fight response. Look how her body language changes.
Crimea River. Really, because feminism is a movement about the discrepancies when it comes to women's equality. Because we're still not there yet. You know, so don't even start with that whole, but you don't think about the men's issue.
If she were wearing a heart rate monitor or a sweat detector, we'd most likely see an increase in her heart rate and an increase in her perspiration because she was clearly having a physiological response to this idea.
Well, then you know what? Start your own goddamn movement, which they have, but maybe make it a little more about legitimate issues like custody and alimony and things that you think are unequal.
The irony of that comment is that men were literally trying to have a dialogue about their issues, and in the movie, the feminists pulled the fire alarm.
A feminist group protesting the event illegally pulled the fire alarm and successfully shut down the event.
They might have been talking about feminist-approved talking points, but everyone was so activated that nobody could listen.
Legitimate issues like custody and alimony and things that you think are unequal, which all stem from patriarchy, not from, oh my God, feminists are trying to take away our kids. No, dipshit. That's not what we're trying to do. We're not trying to do that. I mean, if they look at the root causes of why, for example, women get custody more often than men do, women are supposed to be the mothers. They're supposed to be the natural born caregivers. So obviously, you has a vagina, so obviously you're going to be able to take care of the kitties.
So she just got activated again right there. She calmed her nervous system down. She soothed herself by recentering the feminist perspective.
That's really what it is. It all stems from sexism against women.
And stick with me here because we're looking at this from a nervous system perspective, not an ideological perspective. From a nervous system perspective, it makes sense that she's responding this way. It makes sense that liberal feminists don't want to listen to men because they're perceiving men as the oppressor. And if you're fighting against a villain, you don't want to give the villain more power. And that's how they're understanding this issue. This is why it becomes self-defeating. Even if people genuinely care about men and they genuinely want to understand and work toward correcting men's issues, it becomes very hard to get people inspired to care about men after they're taught that men are responsible for everything bad in the society. Feminism can't get anywhere without the participation of men. So if we want to get anywhere, we have to coordinate. This one-sided thing isn't working. People have been taught to think about issues of gender in black and white, but to only see the relationship between men and women as one where men hold all the power and use it to oppress women may be correct in some situations. Sure. But to say that the only relational dynamic that exists between men and women is one of power imbalance is simply incorrect. That understanding fundamentally lacks the complexity necessary to truly understand the relationship between men and women in the most technologically advanced society to ever exist. It's way too easy of an answer. It ignores all social forces but one. This issue is far more complicated than oppressed oppressor. But organizing and constructing an equitable society can only happen if there's actual listening happening. But the problem is that a lot of the modern social justice framework creates a dynamic in which one cannot even tolerate hearing a perspective outside of the feminist framework because they experience it as violence. And if we cannot tolerate men having a perspective that doesn't center our experience, then why would men be willing to listen to a perspective that centers ours? So this documentary is almost 10 years old, but the gender discourse in 2024 looks remarkably similar to how it did when this documentary was first filmed. What was made incredibly evident to me in this documentary is that there's very little space held for men's issues within the modern liberal feminist movement, and that legacy continues to today. And I am a living testament to that. I am very well versed in feminist and social justice issues. I didn't even consider that any of these male experiences that are outside of the framework of the patriarchy were worthy of my time and attention until deciding to actively shift my perspective after realizing that what I've been taught to understand about gender isn't correct. I hate to say it, but I think a lot of issues that men face, because they don't fit within the framework of the patriarchy, they're not a concern for a lot of feminists. There is a huge problem with feminism, and the problem is that this line of thinking isn't willing to acknowledge the fact that men are oppressed systemically, and that a lot of the problems they experience do not fit within the framework of patriarchy, but that doesn't mean that they're less important or less real. And when I say that about feminism, I'm including myself in that, because I am someone who's identified as a feminist for a very long time. As As someone who really subscribed wholeheartedly to liberal feminism, I was like, no, of course I care about men's issues. Men's issues are important. But I'm now realizing that I didn't know any of them. And it's hard to advocate for something that you don't know about. I think that a lot of liberal feminist discourse is stuck in the place where it insists upon centering the female experience in all cases. But if we only center the female experience, we can only understand the experience of men in the way that they relate to us. There's no actual understanding there. The other problem with liberal feminism is that in order for a man to be listened to, he must be willing to look at the world through the lens of patriarchy, which means that he first must see himself as the oppressor. And I don't really think that inspires a strong desire for participation under these circumstances. Men make up the majority of workers in many industries most affected by automation. Today, men are less likely than women to graduate high school or earn a 4-year college degree. Men are 4 times more likely than women to die by, but 10 percentage points less likely than women to access mental health care. We are experiencing a national dad deficit that not only affects women and children, but also hurts millions of American men who are disconnected from their families. Over the last several decades, girls have overtaken boys by nearly every metric in educational outcomes. Girls are thriving, and that's good news, but the data couldn't be more clear. Something is not working for the boys. It's quite frankly not fair for us to expect them to care about women's rights when anytime they try to care about men's rights, we accuse them of bigotry. I don't think liberal feminism is working anymore, and it's not doing what liberal feminists want it to do. On both the feminist side and on the side of men's rights, we need to realize that men and women's issues are connected deeply. Men's issues are women's issues, and women's issues are men's issues. And the issues that men are facing right now should be central. These are issues impacting everyone. Overall, I think the entire social left needs to recognize that hating men isn't going to get us anywhere. We can justify cruelty and indifference toward the suffering of men as warranted because we already understand them as the people who set up this society to oppress us. Even if it were that simple, and that is what happened, revenge isn't a good way to make a society more equitable. We're traumatizing a whole generation of boys and men. Nobody's caring enough about it. And I think a big reason for that is because if they didn't exist, then we wouldn't be oppressed. These problems were created in a system. And because of that, it means that we need to be willing to acknowledge more than one variable. We need to listen to and understand what men are experiencing right now. We need to learn how to be able to actually consider their perspective critically because it's worth listening to. It directly impacts everyone. The most intense moment that I had while watching this documentary is when I was sitting there and I was like, wait a minute, I've seen this before. But when I watched it the first time, it didn't mean anything to me. I watched it probably 5 years ago, and I remember sitting there and they'd bring up a point and I would intellectually smack it out of the air because of my general animosity toward what I perceived to be the oppressor. I had no ability to critically consider any point that was being made because I was experiencing everything that was said as a threat. So I know that I've said a lot of stuff that is inflammatory, but knowing what I know now, I'm realizing how necessary this conversation is. It is easy to say that women are the issue and we should just go back on feminism. And it is easy to say that men are the problem and we just need to get rid of toxic masculinity. But if we want to approach the truth, which is a requirement of finding a solution, we must be willing to recognize that women are the problem and the solution, and that men are the problem and the solution. And if we want a different trajectory for our boys and men, we have to be willing to look outside of the mainstream cultural narrative to look at this problem differently. Because discounting the suffering of boys and men in the name of social justice is not, in fact, socially just. And we already know that the comments are going to be full of people calling me a pick-me, so I'm going to capitalize on that now by saying that you should pick me by liking and subscribing to my channel. Thank you very much for your time, and I will talk to you later. Oh my goodness, that video took me 10 years. I am so sorry that I've been MIA. I have had to learn so much. I've been studying this like all day, every day. Now that I have a really good understanding of what's going on and I'm a little bit more comfortable filming, I feel really excited about where things are going because this is really important. And it scares me that people don't realize what I said in the video. Like, we can't have a healthy and productive society without healthy and productive men. And the fact that we dehumanize men by just ignoring all of their suffering is just, it's so bad. And it's so much worse than I thought. Like, I'm really excited to share everything with you guys, but it is intense. We just had our first snowfall, so he's been out in the snow, so he's kind of wet and tired. Yeah. Anyway, I appreciate you, and I hope that I will see you soon.